Hi, this is a video on Blake poems that I have posted that have been up for a while, and an explanation of some of the poets that we're not going to have time for, and some that we will have time for. So I want to go through that quickly because if you've looked at the first test, which is essentially short answer and longer essay questions, you've seen a number of poets that we've already covered and a number that we haven't gotten to yet. In order to get to some of the ones who are more contemporary, I'm going to skip some that are already up for most of you. This is something that doesn't apply to students who are doing mostly face to face instruction with me. But if you're mostly remote, uh, ignore the Wordsworth poems. We're not doing Wordsworth. We are doing some of the Blake poetry. Um, there are 4 poems that are uh, included on the test, and I want to talk about those right now. Embedded in this discussion will be assignments that you can complete to show me that you've watched this. So this is primarily an introduction to uh, the poetry of William Blake and to the group of poets that he represents. That we're looking at poets who are called the Romantics, or part of a movement called Romanticism. That has nothing to do with romantic love. It has to do with poetry that is turned towards nature, towards childhood, which had not been a particularly important topic in poetry before the Romantics, and most especially in the power of the human imagination. That's one of the threads that's woven through the Romantic poets that we're going to do. Again, the Wordsworth is up, but unless you're receiving most of your instruction from me face to face, you don't have to worry about Wordsworth. You're not doing Wordsworth. You are doing the 2 Chimney Sweep poems by Blake and the Lamb and the Tiger. You don't have to do the long poem by Blake. We don't have time to do that, and there aren't any questions about that on the take-home test that's due the first week of March. So Blake is the primary person that I'm going to talk about, and I will mention some other people that we'll do afterwards. We need to make sure that we have time for a significant coverage of American poets. So far, we have not done any American poets. However, first with Blake. Blake believed that you couldn't understand anything that was worth understanding without also understanding its contrary. So he would say that anything that matters, like light, if you have an understanding of light, that's because you have been exposed to darkness. If you lived in a world that was always light, where the sun never went down, where you couldn't flip the light switch and have the power go out, if you had no contrast or contrary for the understanding of light, light would be more like oxygen and would just be around all the time. And you wouldn't think about it the same way. We think about things that do have contrasts, primarily in terms of the absence of the contrast. So for Blake, the 2 volumes of poetry that he first published, the first one was Songs of Innocence, the second one was Songs of Experience, but he very carefully went through the Songs of Experience and made matches with most of the poems that he had already done in Songs of Innocence. So there is an innocent chimney sweep and there is an experienced chimney sweep. Look at the poems. It's pretty clear that one sweep is aware of the fact that the indentured servitude that he's forced to endure is manipulation, is exploitation, and causes him pain. And that adults do it because they can't, because they have power. He doesn't. You can see which one that sweep is. It's, I think, very clear by the end of the poem. Um, he acknowledges his awareness. That's experience. You have to be experienced to understand that somebody's manipulating you. You have to understand you may have gone through a phase where you were innocent, but you're not in that phase anymore. Blake didn't believe that innocence was something that you grew out of and that you learned beyond. He believed that innocence was a different way of knowing the world. It wasn't any better than experience. They are contraries, like light and dark. You explain one through the use of the other. However, for people, um, we do go through innocence, and most of us end up experienced afterwards. We can remember and maybe wish that we were still innocent, but the very fact that we know we're not means we're experienced. So they're not it's kind of like optical illusions, where if you look at it one way, it's an old lady. You look at it another way, it's a young woman. You look at it one way, it's a rabbit. You look at it another way, it's a duck. I don't know if you've seen those. You can't see them both at the same time. You can see one or the other. You have to kind of shift your mind. That's the way Blake saw innocence and experience. They make each other, they constitute each other, but you can't be both at the same time. So, The Innocent Chimney Sweep is a poem about uh, boys who have been sold into indentured servitude. Child labor was a real thing in Britain until the 1830s and 1840s. Blake lived before that. So he knew that for kids whose parents wanted to exploit them, this was a way that could happen. Um, but that doesn't mean the boys understand what's happening to them in terms of exploitation. The adults use kids for that kind of work because they can fit up and down the chimneys. They also understood, the adults did, and maybe some of the older sweeps or the more experienced, the experienced sweeps, that it was a job with a really horrible life expectancy. You would die of COPD, of emphysema, of TB. You are working in cold, wet conditions, and you're getting all kinds of crud in your lungs. So um, it's a job that kills boys who do it. And on some level, if you look at the poem on the left, that's the innocent poem. There is an acknowledgement of death because, first of all, Tom Dacre is a new sweep who's come on the job. He's upset. See that they shave his hair off, and the speaker of the poem says, "Hush, Tom. When they shave your hair off, nothing can spoil it." That's a line that would only work on a kid. Because if your hair's all over the floor, well, of course it's not going to get spoiled by a chimney, but that's because it's not on your head anymore. But it seems to work for Tom. And that night he has a dream. The coffins in the dream they're not symbolic to those sweeps of death or anything like the Grim Reaper. They're literal representations of their sleeping conditions. Boys would sleep in really tiny kind of cubicles that were barely big enough for them to fit in, and they would pack them into rooms like sardines. Because again, the adults who were using them didn't really care much for their well-being. They knew that more would come along. If some aged out or died, they could get born. Uh, But that's not how the innocent speaker of the poem sees things. He hears Tom tell about his dream. And you can look at the poem, it's very clear what happens. An angel comes around and lets all of the sweeps out. And they play in the wind. They're clean for the first time ever, maybe. And the last line of the poem, which can seem pretty creepy if you understand kind of the experience point of view. Um, if all do their duty, they'll never lack joy. Um, So the chimney sweep on the right, the experienced chimney sweep would look at that and say, they're the tool that the adults are using to manipulate the boys into doing the work and being kind of happy about it is theology. Uh, the adults are using the idea of heaven to get the boys up early to accept the idea that they're going to die from doing this work and maybe even to be happy about it. That's acknowledging, understanding the layers of exploitation that are happening. So I think the experience point of view is actually easier to understand because we're all experienced. You may have been innocent at one point in your life, but there was a time when you started to ask questions about how things worked and why things worked a certain way. And that's the end of innocence. That's when you become experienced. You may not become experienced about everything at the same time, but um, the experienced sweep understands that theology is a tool of manipulation used by the people who uh, force the kids to go up and down the chimneys. It's interesting, though. The innocent point of view is that there really is a place that's green and beautiful and clean that's just waiting for the boys. And every day they get sicker, every day they get weaker, they get closer to that perfect place. And they don't look at it as exploitation, they look at it as a blessed inevitability. Question, you can't really answer this because you are experienced and you have to be to look at both points of view. But if you could kind of take that chunk of your brain that already knows that the boys are being manipulated, if you could take that out, would you want to know that you're being exploited, or would you prefer to believe what the innocent sweeps believe? Because they have hope and they're happy, and they're happy a lot. It's implied a lot more often, a lot more easily made happy than the sweep on the right. But they're contraries. You can't understand one and then look at the other and say, I've got both of them. And you look at one and say, I understand that because I was that once. But if you're experienced, you can only really understand the experience point of view and maybe wish that you still had the innocence to imagine the innocent point of view. Same thing's true with the lamb and the tiger. Those are the poems, if you just scroll down below the two chimney sweep poems, the lamb's the song of innocence. The tiger's the song of experience. The tiger's famous. If there's one poem of Blake's that you've seen, it's likely to be the tiger. The lamb, Blake was a graphic artist. He was an engraver, and he did illustrations of all of his poems. The illustration for the lamb is of a little boy pointing to a lamb and teaching a lesson. And the lesson is the poem. And the poem is very clear. Little lamb, who made you and made everything about you safe and good? I'll tell you, he's called by your name, by my name. He became a little child, just like he's a lamb, I'm a lamb, you're a lamb. We're all called the same name. And the answer to that is, I think it's not too hard to figure out, is Jesus. Uh, there is an idea of a creator that's perfect innocence and safety. There's not even an awareness of what they would need to be safe from. So it's their innocence is their protection. Now, if you look across the page at the tiger, nothing about what the little boy is saying to the lamb would actually stop a tiger from eating them if one happened to walk by and it was hungry. It would just stop and have lunch. But the fact that they don't know about tigers, that tigers don't exist in their worldview, is kind of a protection. Up until the moment that you're not innocent anymore, their protection will work. But in the tiger, the speaker's asking a much more tricky question than just why do tigers exist. It's what kind of creator would create a killing machine? Um, what's the nature of a God who has, as part of his imagination, a tiger? The tiger had to be part of creation from the beginning. Why tigers? Why predators? Why a killing machine? Why? What is the nature of a God who would need to populate nature with killing machines? And you can think of all kinds of different answers to that. But notice that in that point, one, it talks about symmetry. Uh, First and last stanza are almost identical, but there's a one word difference. And when you think about what the one word difference might mean in terms of the creator's purpose. Two, there's a question, I think it's in the second to last stanza, did he who make the lamb make thee? Which is an acknowledgement that again, you might go through a stage of innocence where you believe everything's safe. But once you understand that there are tigers, kind of metaphorical tigers, people who exploit others, predators who are people, predators who are real tigers, predators who are in the mind of God. Once you understand that, it kind of complicates the question of what innocence exists in relation to. Um, and there's one final thing about the tiger that I think is an important complication. If you, this is easy to find. Just Google Blake's The Tiger. Since he used Tyger, it's gonna pop up. Um, and if you go to images, you'll see pictures of that poem. The tiger's at the bottom. The poem's above the tiger, and the tiger's tail kind of morphs into a tree whose branches frame the stanzas of the poem. And the key question the poem asks is what immortal hand could frame or dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Um, that's interesting. Blake made that image, and Blake's image frames the point that he also made, which is called the tiger. So the answer to the question, who made the tiger, isn't necessarily God. It could also be a person, a guy, William Blake, um, any person uh, who uses imagination can use it to dream up predators. And Blake's done it as a work of art. Literally in the work of art that accompanies the poem. You can see it. The stanzas of the poem are framed by what the tiger's tail turns into, which is branches of a tree. So there are some complexities with Blake that I want you to spend time thinking about. That's enough about Blake. I think that if you look carefully at those two pairs of poems, you should be fine. Remember, you don't have to do The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Don't have to do Wordsworth, even though it has been posted. It's posted for some classes that will have time to do Wordsworth. The next poem that most of you are going to do is Percy Shelley's Ozymandias. And I'll probably need to do another video for Ozymandias and John Keats. There are two poems of Keats that I want to do. But we really do need to go through those quickly so we can get to some American poets. There are a number of poets mentioned on the test, and we may not have time to do all of them. I can tell you right now for sure we're going to do Robert Frost. We're going to do at least one poem by Emily Dickinson, and we're going to do some representatives of a literary movement called the Harlem Renaissance. They come later, and that I'm trying to go in chronological order. So we're working through the early 1800s right now. But for now, do Blake. And as you go, I posted an old quiz. I posted an old quiz that you can use as study questions and turn those in when you're finished with it. All right, thanks.